Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast. I'm Kevin Gostola, and I'm pleased to be joined by Rania Khalek, my co-host. Hey, Rania, why don't you introduce our guest?
Our guest is Shahid Buttar. He is running against Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco, and he is the first person in like her entire career in 30 years to actually have made it past the primary to be able to challenge her, which is a really big deal. So we're really excited to welcome Shahid. Shahid, thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me. I'm really pleased to be here. And I should say I'm the first Democrat in 33 years.
Oh, right.
Republicans have made it before, but I'm the first Democrat.
Right, but they like don't count in San Francisco. No, I mean they don't win. They don't even come close to winning. So it's very exciting. And we have so much to talk about in the next hour. And I guess the first thing we should start with is what everybody kind of wants to hear about, which is related to the fact that you are the first Democrat to present a challenge in the general election against Nancy Pelosi, which is a big deal. And in the last month or so, you have faced some really crazy allegations that I found unfair and shady. I think Kevin did as well. I think Kevin actually knows details more than I do, as usual, is typical of the show. But I don't know if Kevin wants to lead into it.
I think the best way to set this up is to talk about the fact that there seems to be a lesson that can be learned about how these are reported out, because we're already seeing very clearly that the allegations and the recollections about what took place within your campaign are not exactly as they were shared initially with media, and particularly The Intercept, that the narrative that was put out did not match what exactly happened. And so I'm wondering if, as a way to get into the issues that you've had to deal with, you have any comment about the media angle. And the reason why I focus on the media angle is because you're not the only campaign in 2020 that has had to deal with a media that jumped all over allegations against your campaign, and then that resulted in a negative impact before it was even clear that you deserved to suffer consequences. Alex Morse out in Massachusetts, who's running against a similar entrenched incumbent corporate Democrat, Richard Neal, had to deal with totally baseless allegations that are they're in the same vein as the kind of allegations that you had to put up with to a degree, although his has a veneer of homophobia to them. And so I'm curious, because what I see similarly is that in each case, the media immediately takes these as truth, and then it's very difficult for you to handle and manage what is being thrown at your campaign.
You're absolutely right. And I'd say that what Alex experienced was a smear campaign mounted leveraging homophobic tropes. And what we experienced was something similar, leveraging Islamophobic tropes. And it is disappointing to see press outlets rush to publish accusation when even a modicum of investigation would reveal, and did ultimately reveal, that the accusations made towards me weren't grounded in fact. And, there's more to the even story of the press treatment of this set of allegations, and the fact that my former colleagues brought forward someone who had accused me, and just the ethics surrounding that are very curious and puzzling, and to this point unexplored. In my experience over the last month, beyond the press outlets, probably the most disappointing aspect of the aftermath was the race to judgment across local organizations here in San Francisco, many of which had endorsed our campaign and presumed me to be guilty of everything I was accused of, and without considering the facts. The one organization that actually did an investigation, that's the San Francisco Bernie-crats, they voted not to rescind their endorsement. The club's leadership sort of overruled the membership and did so anyway, sort of downgraded it to a recommendation. But the Democratic Socialists of America, the SF Tenants Union, Progressive Democrats of America, all presumed accusations to be true. And I hesitate to observe what that means. But when we presume guilt, when people of color are accused of things, we have words for that. And it's unfortunate, not just for me. I would say it's more unfortunate, frankly, for the city and what it represents about the progressive, the self-described progressive establishment in one of our nation's proudly most progressive cities.
Yeah, and I think that this is something that was always a risk with the whole Me Too style of sort of punishing people publicly before anyone hears them out. We saw it destroyed Al Franken's career, and then ultimately learned that that was like a right-wing campaign against him. That was complete BS. And that to me should have been a huge like red flag about when there's accusations made, we shouldn't just be running with the story. And what I found really interesting was that, The Intercept debunked the Alex Morse story, but was actually one of the leading outlets to push the story against you. So it shows that like there's not really like one outlet or one place or one side that benefits or is hurt by this. It can literally be used against anyone, and the same people who are promoting it against one person might defend another person. So it's like, it's really alarming to me. And also, on top of that, the fact that nobody stopped to second guess this, like the fact that like there was progressives running with this, as soon as they heard anything about Me Too, the critical thinking just stopped, and people just said, okay, we accept it, and they denounced you. And that's so disturbing to me, because that means not only was that wrong to do against you, that means that like that corporate Democrats, mainstream Democrats, which, are constantly on the attack against progressives and leftists, can launch a campaign like this against anyone challenging them from the left and destroy it. Like, that's really disturbing to me, just how effective that can be.
It's certainly been disturbing to me too. I mean, it created very substantial headwinds. Thankfully, it didn't knock me out. The people who brought my accuser forward have been public about their aspiration to end my campaign. That's what motivated them, seemingly. And thankfully, the weight of the accusations wasn't enough to make that happen. It certainly created headwinds. We lost a lot of volunteers, some of whom were in really critical positions, volunteers who were holding down spaces and were convinced, like the local clubs, that these accusations had to be true. And one of the reasons I find really disappointing here is that one of the reasons I think some people thought the accusations must be true, or there are men like that in the world, and I'm the first to acknowledge it. I am not that guy. I've never been that guy.
But even the accusations against you sounded more to me, if you actually read them, like personal beef.
Yeah.
Like, it didn't sound like none of it. There was like, it was like there was this broad thing of like, abusive employer / sexual harassment / misogyny. But then if you actually look at the details of what you're being accused of, it's like, he sent me an email, I didn't like the tone.
Right. That's one of the interesting things here is it's ultimately what we clashed about were campaign strategic differences. And I was really insistent that we run a campaign that leverages volunteer support, that the volunteers do the work and the staff creates a structure for the volunteers. And my former staff was very adamant that they do the work. They were very eager to center the staff. And you can see that eagerness still in the way they relate to, this saga. I mean, I think one of the things maybe that drove this was just the cognitive dissonance and the disappointment in seeing our campaign grow so dramatically after they each found their way to other opportunities. And, I think that for people who centered themselves and thought of themselves as the campaign, I'm not the campaign, I'm the candidate. The people who are the campaign are the volunteers. They're the campaign, and they're the people I'm accountable to. And when I hire people to effectuate a campaign and they're elbowing out the volunteers who I recruited, that is a problem. And that's not the sort of issue that, drove people to raise their voices. They claim I berated them. That's not a thing that happened. They claim that I needed men to ratify women's decisions. One of my former colleagues was quoted in a local news outlet claiming that I needed 3 or 4 men to back up a woman to agree with her ideas. We didn't even have 3 or 4 men on the team. It's so odd, like the facts just don't line up. And yes, you're absolutely right. The meat of the accusations, if you drill down, not only did they reflect, this kind of disappointing interpersonal disappointment, I suppose. They also shifted a lot, which is really, to me, revealing, in that, at one point, my former colleagues were spreading a rumor locally, and it's reflected in the DSA resolution that was quoted by The Intercept, alleging that I had, and I never had any pattern of inappropriate behavior with my volunteers. And that was the story that my former colleagues were spreading. And that was the story that DSA was running with until the volunteer whose story they were telling came forward to say that never happened. And with text messages between a former member of my staff, and this is a white man convincing a white woman to claim that I, a brown man, had done something inappropriate, which I hadn't. And it took her, the white woman, coming forward, frankly, to save me from that narrative. The local press refused to cover it. It took a month for Mike Figueredo at the Humanist Report was the first outlet to show these texts. Mission Local saw those texts. The San Francisco Chronicle saw those texts. 48 Hills, the Bay Area Reporter, The Intercept, all of those outlets published stories that were based on false accusations and a coordinated effort to promote a narrative that was not grounded in fact. And many people bought it. And it is very effective, to your point. And I would just say, at the end of the day, I would hope that people could be judged on the basis of our acts instead of on the basis of accusations, especially when those accusations leverage tropes. This supposed idea that Muslim men are misogynists, that's half the reason we've been at war in Afghanistan for the last 20 years. And I'm not that guy. And anybody who's been close to the campaign knows it. In fact, I have any number of volunteers who frankly did a lot more work on our campaign than the paid staff did. All of those people have been coming forward, and all of them have been getting dismissed. Some of them have been getting bullied, which is particularly alarming to me. Some of them have gotten bullied into silence. And I see this as a threat not to me and not to our campaign. This is a threat to the community. And I do think that the weaponization of accusation has very disappointing effects. And just the sheer number of human hours that have been squandered debating this set of issues when, California is on fire, we're in the middle of a pandemic, and our democracy is hanging by a thread. I mean, these are the real issues, frankly, that I would rather be talking about. And those are the issues that I think San Francisco wants its federal voice to be talking about. And those are the issues that I plan to raise between now and when we liberate the 12th Congressional District seat for Nancy Pelosi.
I don't want to spend the whole time that we have with you talking about these allegations, but there is one larger point that I want to make, and I'll just throw out one more detail. If you want to speak to it, you can, you don't have to. But I was very stunned, given the sensitivity that you're expected to show, that somebody published a Medium post that described the arrangements you're making in order to still have a sex life or a personal life during your campaign for the House against Nancy Pelosi. And that really stunned me. But then another thing I want to point to is, to me, it seems one thing you're up against is this pressure, this fear that people have that if they are wrong, that you didn't do anything, then they themselves are going to wear a scarlet letter. Like, they themselves are going to be tarnished, because then they'll be accused of being people who supported a misogynist. And there's this very awful behavior that I think our social media conduct has encouraged online. And I wonder, if it doesn't have to just be about your allegations, but I wonder if you have anything to say about what it's like for you running this campaign to be introduced to how, 24 hours in the life of social media can fundamentally alter the future of your campaign.
Absolutely. And I'll address each of the points that you raised. The most recent Medium post written by one of my former colleagues is, something between vicious, unethical, defamatory, and false. There's, the piece that you alluded to, the reference, the claim, aside from outing my relationships, I have a non-traditional relationship structure that was outed publicly by my former campaign manager. And it has no bearing on the race. It has no bearing on the issues that they raise. That seemed like a just gratuitous exposure of a private detail. And it hurts. I'll put it that way. That's not something I've chosen to be public about. And to be outed by someone who is now being considered for leadership in a local LGBTQ organization is ironic, let's just say, to say the least. A further piece here, just on the four corners of that particular post, there was a claim that my campaign manager had claimed to know intimate details about my sex life, which I have certainly never shared with them. And it is revealing, and I think presumptuous, that someone responsible for my calendar would respond to a request that I go to dinner with someone in my life or take a holiday weekend camping trip with someone I'm close to, and then presume that's about scheduling my sex life. It's just so presumptuous. And it's not just offensive to me. I mean, there are people in my life who are women who also have been, frankly, not happy, let's say, with that set of reflections. To the point you're raising, sort of beyond that, and what it says about our political culture, we have to put and center and in the sights of our movement and our liberatory praxis, building and organizing coalitions and movements to fight for better policies to improve the lives of people. Identity politics are a grand distraction from that. And I'm not going to say that we shouldn't call out people who have problematic behavior. That's absolutely important. But to weaponize accusation in the service of other goals is, there's one of my supporters here locally, Gloria Berry. She's an Afro-Latina Navy veteran, grandmother. She's an elected member of the Democratic County Central Committee. And she's been very outspoken about what has actually been happening here. And I'm not the only person of color that the local political establishment has turned a blind eye and a deaf ear to. She also, in many of these same clubs that rushed to judgment around me, made very clearly the point that she was recruited by my former colleagues. And the stories that they told her changed from the ones that my accuser ultimately published. And that was very revealing to her. And the thing about it that I think is most revealing is that, many of the people in the community said to her when they were bullying her that, why are you going to bat for this guy? He's running up a hill. There's no way he's going to win. And her response was, I don't care. It's not about him. It's not about if he's going to win. The point here is when you have people of color railroaded on the basis of accusation, that shouldn't happen. And, the idea, I heard any number of people in the club say to me, I understand what you're saying. I have to believe these people because they're my friends. And I just think that that's a really interesting commitment, because when we believe our friends instead of the facts, that is precisely how every incident of racial terror across the South happened. And I'm grateful to still be standing. What happened to me was far less severe than any number of other men of color who've been falsely accused and presumptively judged. And I'm grateful to be on the field to continue fighting for my city. It is certainly disappointing. Not just for me and not our campaign, but broadly the movement. There were a number of organizations, frankly, in which I placed a great deal of hope. Democratic Socialists of America is one of them. And I saw the organization and the local chapters reveal a very disappointing challenge to embrace its own praxis. And when we have people commit to ideals that we don't understand enough to apply when they matter, it's maybe the last thing I'll say here, the most disappointing aspect, actually even more disappointing than the parts I'm reflecting on from earlier, was the very unfortunate participation of some of my critics of color in presuming judgment. And, that it's exposed to me and reminded me particularly of how one need not be white to contribute inadvertently, perhaps, to white supremacy. And it's a thing that I think we have to all be aware of. And I certainly, did not expect to be a target of it in this race, or for it to be such a challenge for us to confront. But again, I'm grateful for the chance to still be on the field. I think San Francisco has certainly a better aspiration for itself than that. And I'm confident that the city, armed with the facts now, as they finally have started to emerge, will see fit to choose a different voice to represent us in Washington.
I think it's all very well said the way you put it, but honestly, just this whole thing makes me angry for all the reasons you just said. But furthermore, like by buying into this, what organizations like the local DSA chapter, it wasn't the national chapter, right? It was the local chapter that like rescinded their endorsement.
That's right. National DSA has always been timid of Pelosi. They hadn't endorsed in our race at all.
Ah, wow. That's really revealing that they hadn't.
Also
But
disappointing.
yeah, also hugely disappointing. But what it demonstrates is that like they're showing themselves to be weak at challenging power. If they that easily fold in a situation where there is so much like there's so many reasons why this accusation could have happened. It could have happened because of personal egos, right? Personal like resentment. But also there's this opportunism. There's a lot to be gained by aligning yourself with those who you feel are in power and are going to stay in power, right? There's like rewards at the end of that road for people who like turn on you. And there's also the possibility, you know, that there's like if this wasn't infiltration, it showed that there's so many opportunities for infiltration. All you need to do to collapse, you know, a progressive organization, if you're like a moderate or a centrist, is, you know, just sprinkle in some accusations that will cause people to fold, as they've demonstrated they will in this situation. So it makes me really angry at like the weakness of people who purport to be on the left. And I know it hasn't tanked your campaign or anything, but it caused a bit of damage. And like you mentioned, people were talking about this instead of the pandemic, instead of unemployment and looming evictions, and instead of the wildfires. Like this was the topic of conversation.
That's right. And it amazes me, frankly, that it was a topic of conversation. I'm grateful for all the people that paid enough attention to be informed by the facts as they finally emerged. You know, my first commitment when I was accused was not to say anything that would keep someone who had a legitimate concern or a legitimate experience from coming forward. I know there are people who have experienced horrifying things who are very close to me, and I don't want to let anybody in the future experience from my words a disincentive or a discouragement for their own stories to be told. And so I've just tried to, you know, keep my elbows in this whole time. And the whole time I was frankly waiting for the press to report the facts. And when, you know, the volunteer came forward with the text messages showing my former staff trying to recruit volunteers to participate in what one of those volunteers described in the text messages as a smear campaign, and the local press wouldn't cover them, I did find myself wondering, well, what exactly is going on here? And, you know, as that stretched into week 3 and the accusations were still being promoted and the facts weren't getting shared, and the facts were out there, any number of people, Gloria, other volunteers had come forward with their own stories, and the press, the local press would not cover them. And it ultimately took national press like you to correct the record. And I'm so grateful that even if, you know, the journalistic standards of the local press leave so much to be desired, that there are still people with an ear toward investigation and a willingness to report the facts. I would say, you know, the accusations that were leveled to me originally by my accuser in DC, that I won't address them because they've already been debunked, but this story was never newsworthy in the first place. And I do think of it, frankly, as a something of a profound tragedy that just so much time has been spent addressing this. But at the end of the day, you know, if anybody gave the mic to my current staff, they'd hear a very different picture. And, you know, they're all with me. They are led by women. And they've been bullied and accused of things by my former staff too. I have volunteers who've been accused of things by my former staff. And like just the expanding circle of accusation has been really, I think, to local networks, somewhat destructive. You know, organizing is about finding and building alliances. And, you know, this campaign to accuse me has attained something of a scorched earth quality. And it is, again, disappointing. I would just hope that the people who think that taking me down will advance the movement, I just hope that they can find ways to build the movement that would move us all forward towards the brighter day that we all seek to build. You know, dragging an immigrant aspirant to represent our proud city down, and I am the first Democrat in 33 years to challenge Pelosi. You know, if people have legitimate complaints about something I've done, I'm here for them, and I'm, as I've shown, eager to let them be heard, and I won't punch back, and I'll let the facts come out. But to weaponize a false allegation of harassment to then promote staff concerns about their workplace experience, I will just say it was disappointing.
Let's go ahead and pivot to some of these issues and let's talk about some of the substance of your campaign. And I'm going to put it like this to get into this latter part of our interview. You're running against Speaker Nancy Pelosi, and in the House in particular, she's been the face of the Democratic Party's response to a global coronavirus pandemic. And I think that there's a lot of things that could be said that are frustrating about how little has been done to defend people who are poor or low income, people in the working class of all demographics. And I'd like to give you a chance to give your assessment on how the Democrats have handled this from, let's say, mid part of February, when it was clear that something was coming our way from Asia, to now, when we know that Congress is on this, or has been on this break, or was on this break. They're having emergency hearings on the Postmaster General, but we see that there isn't any action at all on coronavirus relief. We've resigned ourselves to this joke of an executive order that Donald Trump signed.
You're absolutely right to raise the bipartisan failures of our government's response to the pandemic. Many people have focused on the obvious idiocy of our criminal president. You know, everything from his suggestions to inject bleach and inject sunlight. I mean, just ridiculous things. And alongside that, we've seen corporate Democrats double down on a policy paradigm that places people's lives at risk unnecessarily. Let's get into some of them. In the early rounds of coronavirus stimulus relief, one of the things that Congress helpfully did was expand paid sick leave. Not so helpfully, they included so many exceptions to the policy that it only covered 20% of the workforce. Helpfully, Congress included an extension of unemployment benefits, which have since expired. Helpfully, for the first time, Congress included one-time cash payments. Just to be clear here, the one-time cash payments that happened twice of $1,200 each that went to some tax filers are dwarfed by the $1.6 million tax breaks averaging to each of the 43,000 tax filers who earn more than $1 million a year that Nancy Pelosi prioritized tax breaks for in the middle of a pandemic, before rent and mortgage relief, or before universal health care, or before invoking the Defense Production Act to ensure that we'd have PPE for our frontline medical workers. There's one failure after another. I want to zero in and just like focus on universal health care at the moment, because never has a set of events made more clear the long-standing failure of a preceding establishment. It was brutal and vicious before the pandemic to treat healthcare like a commodity good. Our bipartisan commitment to corporate healthcare is predatory, and it has meant for entirely too many Americans that after they run out of money when they get sick, they end up in the street. Bankruptcy and homelessness correlate to medical costs greater than any other triggering event. If you go to any other industrialized country and you talk about medical bankruptcy, people will not know what you're talking about, because it's not a phenomenon that happens anywhere else. That's a uniquely American experience. And that was brutal and it was vicious before the pandemic. In the middle of a pandemic, allowing cost to be a barrier to care, knowing that your neighbor's contagion is contagious virulently, is senseless to the point of inexcusable stupidity. That's what corporate for-profit healthcare is in the middle of a pandemic. And that's something to which the Democratic Party, led by Nancy Pelosi, and unfortunately, seemingly our presidential nominee, they are committed to that paradigm of so-called care. And again, the pandemic reveals it to be as bankrupt as the wildfires reveal the continuing aversion to climate justice as bankrupt. We need paradigm shifts, and we can't defer them to the indefinite future any longer, because in both of those instances, these are near-term existential threats. And we need to take them seriously and with the gravity that policy change requires. And the idea that we have members of Congress who are settling for tweets aggressively, you know, like tweets denouncing the president's failures without actually showing up for the policies that we need, to better prepare ourselves for the next event and to get through this one, that is an institutional failure. And it's a sadly bipartisan institutional failure that pervades Congress at the moment.
Shahid, I want to ask you about the issue of foreign policy. I think you're one of the few, there are a lot of people that are challenging like centrists from the left, but they're mostly like keeping their focus narrow, just kind of exclusive to domestic politics. Whereas you actually do speak about foreign policy more than just saying we should end our wars. Like very few people have actually spoken out against sanctions or against what we're doing in Venezuela, whereas you have a pretty in-depth analysis about those kinds of things. One, what is your position on foreign policy in terms of our ongoing attempts to overthrow governments around the world? And do you think that you've actually gotten more of a backlash than most progressive challengers do because of your insistence on speaking to that issue?
I appreciate the question and the comparison. I wouldn't necessarily say that I'm any more focused on foreign policy than other candidates. I will say that I've done a lot of work in that arena, and it is a set of concerns for me that to some extent animate not even just my campaign, but I would even just say my being as a human being. I'm in the United States. I grew up here because my family fled a country that was serially subjected to military coups supported by the US military industrial complex. And I am basically a child of that repeated inclination that you described to topple civilian democratically elected governments around the world. Our habit of toppling democracies is why I grew up here. I wouldn't be here without it. And so I have a very ingrained awareness and understanding of that preceding history. I do tend to think of myself as across time, and I'm very, very poignantly aware of the privilege I have growing up in the United States and certainly contending for this office at the moment. In terms of our foreign policy writ large, I'm very inspired and alarmed by the last progressive Republican president. Dwight Eisenhower is a vastly underappreciated figure today. He not only was the Supreme Allied Commander of the victorious forces in the Second World War and a two-term US president, he built the interstate highway system, which was an engine of prosperity for decades. His last act in public before he retired was to warn us in no uncertain terms. I would invite people, check out his speech. This is January 1961. I've written articles about it. It's an incredibly poignant speech. He's like Babe Ruth pointing at the right field fence saying that's where the ball's going to go. And he nailed it. He says in no uncertain terms that the combination of security and industry, the profit motive for defense contractors, for instance, or the profit motive for fossil fuel extraction companies, or the profit motive for fruit companies. People forget half the coups in Latin America were engineered by the CIA to support a fruit company. The precursor to what we now know as Chiquita Brands was United Fruit Company. It toppled democratically elected governments across Central America for a land and resource grab. And Eisenhower saw it coming. He said in his speech that he had to mobilize our nation's industries to fight war in order to beat the Nazis. But here's the problem. It never stopped. We didn't de-escalate. He said at the time that the spiritual character of the United States would be transformed. And he was right. Because today, what do we live in? A land of the free and a home of the brave? We live in a land of the policed and the home of the prison slaves. That's what we live in the United States, right? I mean, every 28 hours, some unarmed person is shot by public safety agents, paramilitary, domestic public safety agents. That, I think, is beyond even what Eisenhower probably contemplated. And just to make this really sorted, I could take this in any of 50 different directions, but only because I have a particular antipathy for the Criminal Intelligence Agency. People forget there's a widespread awareness today that policing in the United States is corrupt. It's why the movement is growing to defund police and invest in better alternatives to secure public safety. People forget why we have militarized police in the United States. It's because discreetly in the 90s, the CIA got away with running drugs into LA and Miami. The agency admitted this years later in the late 90s. In the early 90s, it was revealed by a journalist, Gary Webb, who died of a suicide involving 2 gunshot wounds. Figure that out. his findings were that the CIA was running crack cocaine into US cities to fund its rogue foreign policy. What happened as a result? US cops started dying because they were getting gunned down by narco traffickers, funded, trained, and equipped by the CIA. And did anyone at the agency ever pay a penalty? No. Did the agency lose any of its powers? No. Did it lose any of its funding? We actually don't know because no one's ever seen the bottom line budget for the CIA. It is a classified number. So just put that next to Eisenhower's warning. He says that the military industrial complex is coming for your rights. It will kill democracy. It's 2020. People are dying in the streets effectively every day. We don't even know what we spend on the Central Intelligence Agency, which after it ran drugs and contrived the paramilitarization of police, went on to torture people around the world, then start murdering people with remote flying robots. And now it's led by an unrepentant war criminal who participated in the destruction of evidence of international human rights abuses when she was part of the detainee torture program at the agency. These are figures supported by Democrats and Republicans alike. And I am aghast by that. Ultimately, I'm running for office because I can't stand to let the country that was the beacon of freedom that my family moved halfway around the world to be twice to be in. I can't let democracy in America fall to this. And I am running to defend our republic from the corporate political parties, which did not heed Eisenhower's warning. I understand it all too well because I wouldn't, at least in the figure I am, I wouldn't exist if the things that he forecast didn't come to be. And I'm, like many other Americans of color and immigrants and Muslims or people of all kinds of different persuasions, I am a canary in a constitutional coal mine, and I know all too well that the air is going. And I'm here to do what I can to keep us free and do what we can to restore whatever modicum of liberty that we still can grab in the midst of times like this.
So is Joe Biden going to do all that for us? Did you watch the DNC last week? It felt like Joe Biden. I mean, I love everything you just said, and it's just really like, it's amazing how the Democratic Party, I think, has embraced the intelligence agencies more than ever. Like, I think if you were to poll like the popularity of the CIA, it would be higher in the Democratic Party right now than maybe the Republican Party, because of like the last 4 years of Donald Trump has just moved the whole country, it feels like, to the right in a kind of way. But I guess like the segue here is Joe Biden, right? He's the Democratic candidate for president. We had the Democratic National Convention last week, which seemed like one big advertisement meant to get Republicans to vote for Democrats rather than getting the Democratic base to vote for Democrats, which seems like 2016 all over again. So like, what do you make of all that? As you're basically you're running against the part of the party that is heading the ticket going into November.
I am. That's right. And I would say it reflects the tendency among corporate Democrats to take their voters for granted and to presume votes from communities whose support we have to activate and engage and build. And part of it also is this confused understanding of the relationship between votes and volunteers. Votes obviously matter, but it's volunteers that win elections. And plenty of people might vote for Biden because we know who the alternative is. But at the end of the day, that's not enough. We need to inspire people to actually go out of their way to make phone calls and talk to their friends and do all the hard work that goes into winning campaigns. Pound the doors, make the phone calls, send the texts, host the events. It being a pandemic, events are less central now. But the idea here is that we have to do more than merely appeal to people's shame and fear. We have to appeal to people's inspiration and the visions that we have for a brighter future. And that's what the Democratic Party appears to have effectively entirely abandoned any pretense of doing. And I do think that this reflects a failure of an entire set of institutions to respond adequately to the needs of this moment and the needs of a people who are struggling in the face of multiple intersecting compounding crises. The pretense that yesterday's paradigm can survive is preposterous. I mean, it's just obviously foolish. We can't even maintain the international empire that we've constructed at the moment. We can't even keep Americans alive right now. Like, let's just be real about what we're dealing with here. And it seems to me that the emperor, not just of Trump and not just of the Republican Party or the Democratic Party, but the emperor of Washington is being like exposed with no clothes. And I think the entire world is recognizing that our political establishment is something between asleep at the switch and incapable of responding to the challenges that we face. And it's particularly revealing that so many other countries have attained such better outcomes in the face of this pandemic. It's not as if the coronavirus discriminates. The virus didn't say it's going to hit the United States worse. If anything, we had plenty of advantages. We had advance warning. We have oceans on both sides of the country. If we just did what we needed to, we wouldn't be in this position. We would have reopened the economy by now. The curve would have been flattened and dropped. But because we are so dedicated to capital that we can't care enough about people's lives to prioritize them, we have ended up contriving an entirely unnecessary public health disaster. And I see, again, the leadership of the Democratic Party entirely complicit in this very unfortunate, tragic situation that we found ourselves in. And as we look to the future, I think I see the Biden administration as one that thankfully at least would move in the face of popular criticism, one hopes. I see that the Trump administration would be intransigent and lawless. In California, because I live in a safe blue seat, I don't feel the pressure to vote for a nominee that I don't agree with. But to people in battleground states, recognizing that Trump is the Republican nominee and that the Democratic nominee is the only one likely to contend against him, I don't recommend that people in battleground states follow my lead. But I am very committed when I get to Washington to fighting Biden from the left. I don't know which party the right-wing president will have after their name, but neither of the choices at the top of the ticket at the moment are even remotely satisfying to me. And my job as a candidate and as a member of Congress is going to be to do everything I can to push both the Democratic and the Republican establishments from the left. And I have every intention to do it.
Well, Shahid, we already are seeing signals from figures who are from the neoliberal or the corporate Democratic wing that dominates the party, like Rahm Emanuel going out there and saying that he's going to do everything he can to make sure these progressive politics are off limits to a Biden administration, like the Green New Deal, like the Medicare for All as a policy. That to me is a huge signal of the kind of warfare they're willing to continue to wage against progressives who have been popular, who we've seen winning, like Cori Bush out in Missouri, who have beaten an incumbent. We've seen Jamal Bowman win out in New York against Eliot Engel, who, by the way, was endorsed by Nancy Pelosi. And I'd like to throw out a couple questions to you as we wind down this interview. I think they're somewhat related, but they tie into what we've been talking about here. I mean, one, what are your thoughts on how Nancy Pelosi's endorsements have garnered attention, especially the hypocritical one where she's endorsing Joe Kennedy against Ed Markey, when apparently we've been told all along that we have to support people who are already part of the team and who are in Congress, and that primary challenges like the one you're running are just completely obscene to leadership of the Democratic Party. It's just not a part of being a team player. But I also know that you are someone who has quite a record of taking a stand on privacy and civil liberties issues. And I imagine that you might have watched in the last week and a half as there was this freak out between neoliberals and neoconservatives sharing in this outrage that Donald Trump might potentially consider a pardon for Edward Snowden. And oh my, what would happen? The world might come to an end if we brought him back from Russia and he no longer was able to be used as a pawn for the US government or even as a pawn by the Russian government. I mean, so this idea that he was going to be brought back and people might think he's a hero. But anyways, I think the biggest issue is I see that the Democrats have ceded total ground on a lot of these issues involving privacy, surveillance, involving really important constitutional and civil liberties issues. And I'm constantly concerned that we've ceded ground to right-wing libertarians and that is something I don't have a problem with libertarianism, but the way it's practiced in the United States is very nationalistic and right wing in the way that it is focused. And so I am really concerned about seeing people who react to the idea of Edward Snowden being pardoned and flipping out like there's some kind of attack on our democracy happening if Donald Trump might pardon this person.
It is revealing. Let's talk about Snowden, and then we'll get to Markey. Before I ran for Congress, probably my most visible moment was in 2015. I was arrested in the U.S. Senate for asking a question of James Clapper. This was the Obama administration official whose lies Edward Snowden exposed. And I asked James Clapper, it's somewhat poignant to reflect on this moment in this political moment, because I asked James Clapper how he justified never facing a charge for perjury when Eric Garner had just been killed in the street in New York without a charge, without a trial, on the suspicion of a trivial offense that frankly didn't hurt anyone. And you contrast lethal so-called justice for the powerless with this very permissive, entirely absent justice for the powerful. And, we're talking about grave public crimes on the public record, already documented. That's what Edward Snowden exposed. It was a profound act of public service. He gave up his career and his country to let us know that our government was fleecing us. And I think the fact that you saw bipartisan resistance to the idea of a pardon, it really reveals part of what we're dealing with here. I would describe Trump's interest in potentially pardoning Snowden as kind of like a stopped clock being right twice a day. Another area where he also rarely got it right was trying to diminish the US presence in Afghanistan. In both of these cases, you see bipartisan resistance. And I just wonder, where is the so-called resistance when it matters? Nancy Pelosi talks about resistance while she signed the $4.6 billion funding request to give Trump the money to open concentration camps on the border. She talked about impeaching him on the very same day that she supported his corporate trade deal, which undermined environmental and labor standards around the world. The only thing that Democrats seem to be inclined to actually resist when Trump tries to do them are to bring the troops home, and in this case, to bring home a national hero. And I want to make this clear, a hero to transparency. There was a time in the United States when transparency was a bipartisan value. And it is still a transpartisan value, which is to say that we, the people of the United States, still value it, even if the entire institutional establishment is arrayed in unison to oppose it. And this, for me, is one of my central concerns when I talk about this. It goes back actually to the question I was answering from Rania a little bit ago with Eisenhower and his warning. Government secrecy is as much a threat to the republic as our international interventions are to human rights. And part of my agenda as a member of Congress is to fight for transparency. And I've seen members of Congress do this very effectively before. The reason that I've been endorsed by former US Senator Mike Gravel is because Gravel played in Daniel Ellsberg's situation very much the same role that I would hope to play for a future Edward Snowden. And one reason that Edward Snowden is in international exile instead of, frankly, in Congress, where I dare say he belongs, is because A, you can't get a fair trial in this country if you are a national security whistleblower, and because there's no member of Congress at the moment willing to go to bat for the truth in the way that Senator Gravel did in the prior era. And I see the declining capacity of Congress to conduct oversight really reflected here. We have to stand with whistleblowers. It's how we learn the truth. When executive officials lie in oversight hearings, the only way we get the facts is when whistleblowers come forward. And I'm very committed to whistleblower rights. Edward Snowden is a national hero. I dare say that if the president does pardon him, it would be a political master stroke. It would be very dangerous electorally for the Democrats. And it's the reason why is because Democrats didn't do the right thing when it mattered. And I could make that case 50 different ways on different issues. But at the end of the day, the reason that people are concerned about Trump pardoning Snowden is because Obama should have done it first, and he didn't. And I think that was one of the, frankly, glaring failures of his administration. And then finally on Markey, you raised that question too with Pelosi's endorsements. It's not just the case that Nancy Pelosi revealed her hypocrisy in endorsing a challenger to a sitting Senate incumbent. She also, in endorsing Joe Kennedy, has taken a stand against climate justice while our entire state is on fire and Houston is about to confront 2 hurricanes at the same time. Just the audacity astounds me. And it's worse than that, because the reason she supports Kennedy, so I understand, is because they're both members of allied dynastic families. And if there's anything that I absolutely detest more than corporate Democrats undermining the interests of their constituents, it is the idea of politics as an inherited office. We fought a revolution to establish this country. There's an anti-nobility clause in the Constitution. Political dynasties are offensive, period. And whether it's the Kennedys or the Clintons or the Pelosis, I'm not here for it. And when I say that I'm here to defend our democracy, among the things I'm here to defend it against are family dynasties. They have no place in our democracy.
Right on. I'm like ready to go to the ballot box.
We've got to move to California and establish. It's a little too late, but well, I mean, and to what you say, just as we conclude here, the thing that I've noticed in a lot of these races is how absurdly long some of these representatives have been members of Congress. The people who are falling have been there for 15 and 20. And unfortunately, Jen Perlman didn't do very well against Debbie Wasserman Schultz, but that's some race that I was looking at very intently because of the fact that this is someone who has been there for nearly 20 years, and it's not clear that she's had any meaningful impact as a representative, at least as far as I'm thinking in terms of the progressive left. You know, like, what has she done that justifies her being there for 20 years?
She's made a lot of money for herself and her friends and the people who fund her.
And I guess what I'm saying is, I think, you know, if you have any final words here, and you don't have to necessarily address this if you don't want, but should we have term limits? Should there be some kind of a way to make sure that Congress turns over more quickly, because these people are there for so long and don't do anything?
Forgive me here, because I have a hard time speaking in very short sentences, but I want to give you the real answer here. So I support judicial term limits. I support ways to encourage congressional turnover short of term limits, because they have unfortunate consequences in the legislative context. So the key to ensuring turnover in legislative offices is campaign finance reform. We have to take out the opportunity for corruption in political financing. That's the key to ensuring legislative turnover. Where we don't talk enough about term limits is at the judicial layer. We appoint judges for life. The Supreme Court right now is stacked with unrepentant veterans of the executive branch, criminals, and in at least Kavanaugh's case, you know, I could go on about I hesitate to just come up with the terms to describe that man. But the idea that a Supreme Court with a justice like that is supposed to decide what the law is for the rest of us, it's a farce. But the only way to turn the court over, some people have proposed adding seats to the court. I think that's an inelegant solution that would compromise the body's independence. I think the way we want to rescue the court and our system of laws is to implement 18-year staggered terms for Supreme Court justices, to introduce fluidity in that institution as well. The way we have it now, the court is basically chained to the past, and the future can't survive that. None of our institutions can afford to be chained to the past. And in the same way that we need fluidity in Congress, we need it in the courts as well.
Thank you for your time. Rania, anything else for our guests before we...
I think I'm all out of questions. I think that was a really good answer. And that was what came to mind as well for me, is because with term limits for the legislative branch, there's also the issue of, like, term limits wouldn't fix the issue of corporate lobbyists buying our elected officials. So I think that's,
you just trade in one corporate. Yeah.
They'll figure out a way around that. They'll just, like, find new people to fund for each term limit, just like they do with the president.
Well, they're very good at finding these people who can continue as they pluck disaffected workers from your campaign and bring them in to be the next generation, and their badge of honor is
too soon. Too soon.
Sorry. November election day. We wish you the best of luck with your race, and thank you for giving us your time. I'll say for our show, as we conclude, that for people who are watching this interview, if you go to patreon.com/unauthorized disclosure, that's where you can go to become a subscriber and support this show. Until next week, thank you for watching, and we'll be back soon with another episode.